U.S. history. Welcome back. As you can plainly see, this thing is magnificent. Despite the doubters, the quarantine mustache is coming in real nice. We've been talking about the New Deal. Excuse me, we've been talking about the Great Depression. Today, we're going to get into the New Deal. The New Deal, as I mentioned yesterday, it doesn't ultimately get us out of the depression, but it goes a long way towards mending the American economy and also fixing the American psyche. This was no pun intended. It was extremely depressing. And America was experiencing a level of hardship that really these Americans had never experienced. Now, I will say, if you consider that in 1932, there would still have been Civil War veterans walking around, then I think, could argue that they have seen things worse than they were in the Great Depression. But still, America looked to a president who could provide comfort and who could help to fix the problems that they were facing. And they were facing major problems. I won't go too much more into the statistics on joblessness, stock prices, etc. But you can revisit yesterday and Monday's lesson and take a look back at the stats if you want to. But it was colossal. Remember, right now, I just finished watching a news program talking about just how horrible our unemployment is right now. And it is very bad. It is roughly a third of what it was during the Depression. So my point is just that America was desperate for a change. And Roosevelt reaps the benefits of that need for a change. His philosophy was more or less the exact opposite of Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover has that quote we read where he flat out says it's not the government's job to fix people's problems. He uses the argument more or less that if you go around fixing people's problems, they'll never learn to fend for themselves. Just extremely hands off, extremely laissez-faire. Whereas FDR, like I said, was essentially the polar opposite. He felt like the job of the government, the federal government specifically, was to mend the economy and was to help resurrect society. And he was very deliberate about that and came up with a very thorough and comprehensive plan that he's going to call the New Deal. Hoover, when he ran for president the first time, he won by a massive margin. He lost most of the Southeast. In fact, more or less all of the Southeast, but the entire rest of the country, Hoover won. Hoover was so unpopular, though, that FDR really moonwalked to the White House. Not only that, but the Dems won support and won the majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And we haven't talked a ton about political science in this class, but if the Senate, the House, and the president are all in the same political party, that makes things much easier to get through policy and laws, etc., that the president might want to get passed. So FDR was moving forward with the full support of the American people, to the extent that anybody ever has full support, but major support. A very strong desire on the part of the American citizens for something completely different. Roosevelt not only had credentials as a governor of New York, he was governor for 2 terms, but he was also essentially an American aristocrat. He was very wealthy, respected society member, and he's a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. Who Teddy Roosevelt, love him or hate him in terms of his politics, he was and is viewed as an iconic American president. He was this rough and tumble, big stick guy. And FDR was very different in terms of his political approach. But the fact that he shared that last name gave him a level of credibility. Combine that with the fact that he was the governor of New York twice, and he was poised to step into the White House, really more so than Hoover was when he was elected. So they do run Hoover again, the Republicans, but it's it's a waste of time. This is a massive majority electoral vote, right? So that's referring to the actual delegates in the electoral college that they picked up. And then popular vote is what it sounds like. That's um, the actual number of people who voted. So all in all, almost 40 million people voted. People recognized that this was a very, very critical election, and that basically, in a lot of ways, the future of the country depended on where it was going to go in the next 4 years. FDR coins the phrase "the New Deal." It's smart marketing. He Even if you don't like the fact that he expanded government so much, he was no dummy, and that was a great marketing ploy to to call it the New Deal. People wanted something new; they were desperate for it, and he hits the ground running. Really, the 100 days is a label given to his first how many days in office? 100, from March to June. And during the 100 days, there's a reason that we refer to that period. He really starts putting in a lot of these programs, these social welfare programs and economic uh, revitalization programs that he had campaigned on. 100 days. There he is. Look at that. Saturday Evening Post, founded by Benjamin Franklin. Truthfully, I had not seen that. That's interesting. So, FDR's philosophy: give people jobs. And to give them jobs, you would have to spend money. And this money, these jobs wouldn't just be made out of thin air. Um, in other words, you had to create programs and organizations and associations to put these Americans to work. So we're going to see uh, a lot of new organizations designed to improve infrastructure and that sort of thing. But more than anything, just to give people jobs, to give them work to do. So he also wasn't afraid to work through what we call deficit spending. In other words, spending money that you really don't have, with the mindset of, if you want to make an omelet, you've got to crack a few eggs. In other words, you got to spend money to make money. Congress passes more than 15 major pieces of legislation. That is a very, very big number for 100 days. And again, they, FDR and Congress were able to do this in large part because they had a majority in both houses and control of the executive. If you wanted to sum it up in four words, what did FDR do? What was his mindset? What did he think the best approach was to resurrecting the economy? It would be make the government bigger. So new government programs. Here's a piece of propaganda from the era. Get busy, pointing right at you. So banks in the U.S. had absolutely fallen apart. Remember, there were banks. We had money shortages in banks to where somebody, I don't know if you recall the political cartoon we looked at yesterday, but even people who were not invested in the stock market, um, some of them lost all their money because the banks they had their money in just ran out. And when we read or when we listen to, we're going to listen to a part of one of Roosevelt's fireside chats. And in that chat, he actually does a very good job of explaining what happened to our banking system. He takes office. Literally one day later, he says it's a bank holiday. And he's going to persuade Congress, a Democratic Congress, to pass the Emergency Relief Act. The Emergency Relief Act authorized the Treasury Department to inspect the nation's banks. And we actually just were talking about financial policy in government class. And the Treasury Department still inspects banks, more or less trying to determine if their business model is okay, if they're taking the necessary precautions to protect their clients, etc. Because Hoover and his Republican colleagues, their laissez-faire attitude or approach, of course, had been a colossal failure. Thanks in part to Roosevelt, or in large part to Roosevelt doing this and establishing the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and he got that created through an act called the Glass-Steagall Act. The FDIC, as it's usually referred to, basically insures people with bank accounts up to $5,000, which $5,000 today is 100 grand. Most people in America don't have $100,000. I mean, there are people with billions, but vast majority don't have 100 G's in their savings account. Or maybe they do, but my point is that $5,000 in the early 30s was a large number. So the fact that now people's money, when put into banks, is protected, insured by the federal government, they might be more inclined to put their money in banks to do business with a bank anyway. Because you can understand if you lost all your money in the stock market crash and your bank went broke and closed down, you'd probably be pretty hesitant to get involved with banks again. And some people did. I mean, for the rest of their lives, the money they did have, they stuck it under the mattress, put it in a coffee mug or coffee jar. But Roosevelt knew that for the economy to really be back healthy, people would need to once again have some trust in the banking system. He also gets the Federal Securities Act passed, and that requires stock information to be accurate and truthful. He gets the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA. That's going to raise crop prices by lowering production. If you guys remember, when we're talking about the Depression itself, people didn't have money, so they couldn't afford to pay good prices for farmed goods. Since the profits that these farmers would be making would be so tiny or non-existent, because they couldn't charge a livable, they couldn't charge a price that would justify their farming efforts, or that would justify them, transporting these things to market, etc. They had an abundance, they had an excess of supply. In other words, supply exceeded demand. I kind of stumbled over that one, but uh, basically, the AAA is going to raise prices by telling farmers, okay, we want you to grow less, and we'll pay you for that stuff that you're not growing. The Tennessee Valley Authority is one of the better known uh, agencies that FDR put in. One thing that the TVA did was they built a lot of dams. Dams were useful for a number of reasons. They can provide electricity, but more than anything, they can help with flooding. But really, they were just colossal projects that people had to work on. They required laborers. So why not build another dam? These are all major dams. Got some in North Georgia, kind of by Chattanooga, but Tennessee Valley. There's a reason they called it the Tennessee Valley Authority. All these agencies, TVA, the WPA, the AAA, we call those alphabet agencies for obvious reasons. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, their main goal was to put young men to work. So that would be people ages 18 to 25. And they would give them jobs doing manual labor, building roads, parks, planting trees. In fact, if you recall the Dust Bowl, a lack of trees and droughts was those were two of the primary causes. So they go to the Dust Bowl areas and plant 200 million trees. These are all things, and this is my own personal political philosophy, but these programs were terrific because not only did they give jobs to people, but they were important programs as well. They were accomplishing important things um, as well. By 1942, 3 million men worked for the CCC. You guys know what's going on then, don't you? 42? Spoiler, it's a world war. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, that's part of the National Industrial Recovery Act. And they provided money to states to build schools and community buildings. A lot of building, a lot of infrastructure improvement. The CWA, Civil Works Administration, They built 40,000 schools and they pay teachers, 50,000 of them in rural America. These rural teachers, these teachers out in the country or small towns, they weren't getting paid, at least not what they should have been or typically would have. And yeah, as I mentioned, infrastructure improvements. They built 500,000 miles of road. The CWA. The FHA, Federal Housing Administration, that's going to give home loans, mortgages, and is going to help people pay for their repairs. The FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Agency, gives 500 million in direct relief to the poorest Americans, the neediest Americans. I don't know what the conversion would be on 500 million, but in today's dollars, that would be approximately a ton. They also, by the way, shout outs to my great grandfather, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. They put people to work. It was very similar to some of those other ones we just talked about. He got a job with the WPA, and according to my late grandmother, it essentially put food on the table. So, if you're a leader, you really you're never going to please everybody. If you're the president of the United States, for you to please every single American 100%, that's essentially impossible. And that's proven by this, because Roosevelt, who was up to that point and probably ever the most liberal president in the history of the country, some left wing liberals felt like he wasn't doing enough. On the right, they felt like it was way too much interference and that we have a free market and our free market should be left alone. So Roosevelt is simultaneously being criticized for being too liberal and not liberal enough. You know, this is a quote that a teacher of mine once told me when I was in high school. And I objected then, and I have to object now. Churchill is somebody I admire a lot. Although he was British, he's in some ways an American hero. Um, he says, "Any man who's under 30 and is not a liberal has no heart. Any man who is over 30 and is not a conservative has no brains." Well, I'm 34, so apparently I have no brains. But you get the point of what he's trying to say. Maybe you don't. It doesn't matter. Some of this stuff was getting some of Roosevelt's more progressive programs are getting scrutinized or examined by the Supreme Court. A couple times he's going to be defeated by them. Says the NIRA has too much government, provides too much government control over industry. They also struck down the AAA. The Supreme Court at the time said that farming, that agriculture was a state matter, a local matter, not federal. Again, it's just such a classic case, excuse me guys, of competing political philosophies. Some people would think it most certainly is the federal government's job. Um, Others say leave it to the state. Roosevelt tried to do something called packing the courts. And from the mid to late 1930s, he was able to appoint seven new judges to the Supreme Court. The fact that he is appointing seven new judges means presumably that the Supreme Court is going to think like he thinks and support what he supports. This guy, Charles Coughlin, he was a very nutty guy. Um, but when he was at his height, he had 45 million listeners. The problem is, Coughlin was getting support from people for FDR not approaching the New Deal correctly or not approaching our economic issues correctly. And a lot of people agreed with that. He had a lot of listeners. Unfortunately for Father Coughlin, he began incorporating a lot of anti Semitic or anti Jewish elements in his speeches. So, of course, there were plenty of people who loved that, but ultimately that caused him to lose support, really to lose steam. Another critic is this fellow, a very interesting cat, no doubt about it. His name's Huey Long, and they made a movie about him probably 10 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. Um, I might try to, in fact, I will. I'm going to try to find either radio or video of Huey Long speaking. Uh, he was just a compelling speaker, love him or hate him. And Long, his attacks on FDR were largely trying to set the stage for his own presidential run. Unfortunately for him, he was assassinated in 1935. Now, Long and Father Coughlin both used the radio to promote their views. Remember, it wasn't that long ago before this that we didn't have radios, at least not. We had radios, but certainly they weren't sitting in everybody's living room. Um, so this new medium or this new platform, the smart politicians, the really savvy ones, took advantage of it. And Long and Coughlin were examples of that. But Roosevelt and his fireside chats really are the shining example of reaching the American citizens through the radio. So he easily wins the second term. Republicans nominate this guy, Landon. He had no chance and he lost. And yet again, not only does FDR win, but he has majority control of both houses of Congress. So, um, on the one hand, Roosevelt had probably the hardest job of any president, aside maybe since Abe Lincoln. But at the same time, he was set up for success in the sense that he, like I said, he had allies in both houses. That just makes it a lot easier to get your policy implemented and to get things enacted that you want to see enacted. So he's made it to a second term. The New Deal in the first term, in his first presidential term, had a lot of success. So what are you going to do? You get elected again? The second New Deal. And I think with that, we're coming up on our 30 minutes. So I think with that, we'll pause there. tomorrow, we'll check this out. It's actually it's pretty long. It's 13 minutes, but it's Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat, and that's just one of my. It's not a battle or some grand treaty that was signed or anything like that, but just in terms of episodes in American history, or not episodes, but phenomena in American history. I find that to be a really, really interesting one and pretty compelling. So, with that, I'll pull myself back up here, guys. Keep on doing your work. Most of us have done a really good job of that. So, keep it up. I know that this is new for all of us, but you guys are really doing a pretty good job. So, keep at it. And with that, I'm going to sign off. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Be good to your siblings. Don't drive your parents nuts. Be safe.